The Loft remained a psychedelic kind of party. David talked about love, or he talked about music, or he might talk about community, or he might talk about freedom. Many on psychedelics, dancing to incredible music. A lot of it is about themes of love or freedom or dancing with incredible instrumentation. And there's going to be something collective emerges. That's something that is between all of these bodies in the room and the music. So it becomes sort of psychic on some level, and people can feel connected with each other and with humankind and with the universe. Now, you can call these things spiritual experiences. I think that's absolutely going on. It happened through practice, and it was experienced. You left with a heightened sense of sensation or of love. David's music selection was like so advanced.
What I was wanting to ask you is about the utopia. The beginnings, there's always been a clash between the electronic music, as we call, and the clubbing culture, and the hippie period. It's like there was a blank of 8 years.
Up until 1970, DJ culture was boring culture, generally speaking. There was one called The Haven, I think opened in 1969. It was quite interesting. But generally speaking, DJs were employed to get dancers to drink at the bar. So they would play a short sequence of records going from slow to peak in 5 or 6 records, and then they would put another slow record. So they would say they would kill the dance floor to get people to go to drink alcohol. Alcohol is not a good dance drink. Generally speaking, it's a depressant, and it doesn't mean it makes you sad, it means it depresses your senses. You don't hear as clearly, you don't see as clearly, you lose control of your body movement, your speech starts to slur. If you're a heterosexual guy, you might start to invade the space of women. It's not a good party drink, thing to consume at a party.
Actually, it was one of my questions.
Okay.
Was there alcohol in the Loft parties?
No, never. I mean, now what David would eventually say in the 1990s, maybe in the late 90s, you can bring your own bottle if you want to. So David was a utopian. David drew on all these exciting developments in culture. Loft living, LSD, developing a beautiful stereo sound system where you can close your eyes and it sounds like the band is in the room. Yeah, it's that good. Well, the Rent Party, this was David's one of the main inspirations as well. Loft living, beautiful sound, music from everything that was available and danceable, cutting across time and space. New music, older music, music recorded in the United States, music recorded in Africa, in Europe, Latin America, didn't matter. Music that you want to listen to. No categories count, really. So David was doing all these things, and David was very involved in counterculture. He was primarily committed to civil rights movement and anti-war movement. These are very important to David. He wasn't actually particularly involved in gay liberation, but what he said to me is he supported all liberation movements. He was pro every liberation. David was primarily a man who enjoyed having, let's say, sexual relationships or relations with other men. That was his taste, his sex. But generally speaking, he never had a partner as such. His devotion was to the party and to that community. And it didn't allow for a regular relationship. That was his level of devotion. So David, when he came to New York, enjoyed going to rent parties. He didn't like the discotheque scene. The discotheque scene was boring. David was, he was into maybe festivals. He loved Tompkins Square Park, where everyone would just show up and it was like a festival every day. Bands would play, Jefferson Airplane, I think, played. Everyone was playing, it was an open, improvised culture. People coming together from different backgrounds. The way of the socializing that David really liked was the rent party scene that dates back to the Harlem Renaissance. And that was African Americans had moved from the rural South to the industrial North in search of jobs in manufacturing, in industry. And they were living in Harlem, and they had absentee landlords who were charging too much rent. They couldn't pay the rent, so it started to invite people over to their homes for a party. And the friends would donate some money at the door, and that money would go towards paying the rent. So there's poverty partying. And that culture carried on through to the point when David arrived in New York in 1962. And his favorite form of socializing was in these rent parties. They were primarily black parties, but it wasn't exclusive. David just loved the intimacy. You could form a community. Because it was in someone's home, you could relax. No one was ripping you off. So the Loft, the party that he started in 1970, different forms of partying before then in his loft. He moved into his loft in 1965. Then he started to have like more dance-oriented parties, and he got a DJ from this kind of bar restaurant with a bit of a discotheque, if you like, called Max's Kansas City. He teamed up with the DJ from there and another guy, and they ran a party called Coalition in David's loft, but it never quite worked. And it was in February 1970, David brought all these things together. The rent party with a private invite. He developed his beautiful stereo sound system. It was still in his loft. He had all the music. He had taken a real interest in music. Valentine's Day 1970 happened to be a Saturday night, and it became known as the Love Saves the Day party. And that was partly because everyone took LSD at this party. And that was the first time David selected the music, as well as being the host of the party. So this is the beginning of a party that became known as the Loft. It was not a club. It was not a club. It was not a club or a discotheque. Discotheques are licensed. You have to sell alcohol, and you have to close at a certain time of the night. These laws were introduced during the Prohibition era. The cabaret license. They were very repressive. David was pursuing freedom. David wasn't a hippie. I mean, he looked like a hippie. Everyone had long hair, right? Everyone was taking lots of LSD. Everyone was into freedom, but he wasn't actually. David wasn't into categorizing. I asked David once, "Were you a hippie or a yippie or a, you know?" It's like, no, it wasn't any of it. The hippies were more into like their politics, and they started to behave in a. Real hippies lived in the woods. David was an urban guy, basically. He lived in the city. He loved what the city offered. So he wasn't against the hippies, but he wasn't a hippie as such. It was a very open time. So, yeah, there was lots going on. There was lots of liberation movements in the air, and David embraced them all.
He catalyzed that spirit in a way.
Yeah, he processed it, absolutely. Well, we as humans, this is all we are. It's like, all we are is like, we are super advanced processors. We get information, and through our brains and our bodies, we process it. That's what we do. That's how we develop. If we don't do that, if we are locked from our birth into a dark room and we have no other external information to process, let's see what happens. Nothing happens. There's a few cases in history, of recorded cases, of kids who are abused by their parents and they're locked in a cellar for 7 years. They have no interaction, their brains, that nothing develops. They're like vegetables. So this is David's philosophy of the world. You could say it's a psychedelic philosophy of the world. Everything is interconnected. Human beings often, and societies especially today, likes to make us think of ourselves as individuals. The individual is a relatively modern conception. The individual comes through in like Renaissance period, like 15th, 16th century. Before that, people didn't really think of themselves as individuals. Now, especially through capitalism, it's rampant. You know, we look at Apple technology, the iPhone, the iMac, the i-this, the i-that, I. And Dave was like, we're all interconnected. And everything we do is not really from the self. David had this relationship to music. He was like, look, the musicians have created the music. I'm not into being the DJ who is the ego performer. He did pretty much everything he could to not be the ego performer. He never thought of himself as a DJ. Ever. And he wouldn't mix records because he didn't want to interfere with the music. I mean, he would do a little bit of blending. Eventually, after several years, he'd let one record finish and then the next one would start. He's like, the music is greater than I am. He'd say things like, music is a gift from the gods. And it's not that he really believed, it's like a Greek idea of the gods, really. There's forces in society, there's forces in the world, in nature, and we are privileged. The Greek idea of the god is like, you are honored to be in the presence of the god. And the gods take a human form, and they bring gifts, or music, or life, or harvest. So David, that was like, music is a gift. He really believed in this thing called life, and the life energy of music. That music brings life. And we know it does, it connects us. Because music, like all sound, it enters our bodies. Visual experiences, where we're sitting here looking at each other, or going to the cinema. My eyes are telling me that you are sitting 3 feet away from me. You're not entering my actual body as such. Music enters the body, not just the ears, the whole body. So it connects people. It's why going on a dance floor or to a concert, especially a concert where there's a bit of movement. We have a very different experience from going to the cinema. When people try and bring screens into or party situations, generally terrible. Because the screen, you just have to stop and you look at it and it's external. You stop moving, basically. Whereas we want to move, dance with each other or hug each other, let the music enter our bodies. Anyway.
It's a really interesting concept. It's kind of linked with, you were talking about LSD, the effects are enhancing this natural thing. Amplifying a lot. If people you say they were taking, it was part of the party in the beginning, really.
Absolutely. Everyone was taking LSD.
Everyone.
I mean, there may have been a small number of people who won't. It wasn't just in the Loft. This was across the whole of New York City. People going out were taking LSD.
And these kind of the effects of the LSD resonates with how the people behave, the community feeling, the loving feeling,
Of course.
And I was thinking about the length of his sets, which are kind of the length of a trip.
Well, initially, I've tried to work this out. Well, later on, it was 12 hours. Initially, Broadway, David's first Loft space, the party would start at midnight. Officially, it ended at 6, but it might go on to 7 or 8. So yeah, there's the LSD trip is a bit longer than that. By the time David got to Prince Street, the parties were going on for 12 hours, and sometimes a fair bit longer. David was the first person who approached a dance floor and wanted that dance floor to be a form of utopia. Before David, the dance floor was primarily seen as a place of people coming together, but mainly a place to listen to music, maybe take some substances, maybe have drink some alcohol, maybe meet someone for sex. David's idea was beyond having a good time. It was creating a world that is a heightened version of what we can be. Yeah, it's a form of perfection. Once you paid a small sum of money at the door, for the first few years, David was running the parties at cost price. He was making no money from the parties at all. But he had another source of income.
What was it?
I'm not going to talk about what he did.
But how come he could do
that? And he never once advertised the party.
Yeah.
Not once. It was word of mouth invites. He never had an ad, he never had a flyer. It was the only underground party pretty much I've ever come across. I mean, there was a few that replicated what David did that lasted for a few years, but were also underground, it's fair to say. But generally speaking, David was underground, and it really was, and he saw it as a necessity.
The fact that the party is in New York, kind of center New York, he didn't have noises.
Well, it was downtown. It was industrial. So there were artists and musicians living there. Look, David had some trouble with his neighbours who lived above him at
for
his
making
first
parties.
place. Yeah, so he would say, you come to the party for free. Yeah, it was a bit of an issue. When he went to Prince Street, I don't think he had anyone living directly above him. Either side of him was sort of commercial, industrial spaces. So he didn't have a problem with neighbours in Soho. And then when he went to 3rd Street in 1984, he also didn't really have problems with neighbours coming. He had a very big, there was enough distance. Next door to him in 3rd Street was the Nuyorican Poets Cafe.
So basically, I met the spirit of love. The Loft still lives today. How long did he?
Well, the Loft is still running. I mean, David passed away in November 2016, and he stopped going to the party probably around 2012. He stopped putting on music around 2011.
You mean he never stopped doing parties?
No, right to the point. And a month before he died, he hosted another party. He did it from his apartment. He lost everything by 1994. He had a lawyer who he entrusted the deeds of the property somewhat foolishly, because he got into some difficult situations. And to get out of that difficult situation, he had a lawyer help him pay off electricity bills and also he owed Con Edison a lot of money. He got a lawyer to do it for him. At one point he went on sabbatical for 2 years because he got into stuff that I would say he never regretted, but it produced challenges, different substances, let's say. And that lawyer ended up running off with the property. So he lost everything. When I met David for the first time in 1997, unquestionably he was the poorest person I'd ever met. And I would say he remained the poorest person I ever knew for the entirety of the rest of my time, knowing him as a friend or whatever.
Wow.
But he didn't care about material possessions. He didn't care about material possessions.
Yeah, he never recorded anything as...
There's one set of tapes. Oh no, he never did remixes. He wasn't into that. He was happy to let the musicians or the remixers do that.
And one question I have, why he wasn't bringing some jam sessions inside it?
He didn't know there was when he started this amazing group called the New York Record Pool. David was a proper socialist, so he understood a DJ, he and other DJs, through playing this music that was often the record companies hardly knew they'd even made the music. They were just like capitalist or corporate entities. Not all of them, but many of them. And the DJs who had this ear for what would work on the dance floor that the corporate executives or the record company heads may not have the same ear, the DJs knew what would work. And the dancers would go out and buy the records and they would produce hits. And sometimes they would sell 1 million copies. And the DJs were having to go buy music from the record stores. They were then turning into hits that might sell 1 million copies, and the record companies were going, great, we're making those. And David was like, this is not fair. The record company should be providing promotional records to all of the DJs for free on an equal basis. And he started an organization called the New York Record Pool, and he did this along mainly with another DJ called Steve DeQuisto, and he gave the space for the record pool for free in his second space on Prince Street, 99 Prince Street, and that was where the record companies would deliver the records and the DJs would go and collect the records for free.
Oh, wow.
This was
It
was a way of supporting the DJs.
And it's the only way at the time to get
So David was into that. Other DJs would say, I broke this record, I broke that record. And I would ask David, did you break this record? I heard you. David would say, no, we all played the records.
Finders keepers.
But he never got into actually trying to make the music. But David had a lot to run the party, all aspects of the party, every week, to listen to all the music so that he could play new music.
So what I meant, there was some parties where he played the music and there was some musicians as well.
Oh, sorry, I completely forgot. I lost my track of. So when David was playing the record pool, I've lost my track of train of thought.
But the record pool is way after, no?
No, the record pool started in 1975, and at that point, it was in David's home, basically, that all the records would be distributed. And David arranged for musicians, bands, to come and perform for the DJs, and to get more people to come along, he'd invite dancers along too. So there were free concerts in David's space. And he carried this on right through to the 1990s a little bit. He stopped running the record pool in I'm trying to remember, I should know this. I think it was late 1978. It could be late 1977.
They say that didn't last for long. No,
for about 2 or 3 years, there would be live bands would come and perform for free. Because that was a form of for them promotion. Connecting with the DJs, connecting with the dancers who would love their records, as a way of spreading the word. It was fantastic. I mean, the Paradise Garage picked this up afterwards, but they would charge extra when there was a band playing, a well-known performer.
I wasn't talking about like a real band playing, but more like
jamming.
The fact of jam session for people to dance to is quite original.
What happened is people would take different forms of percussion instruments. Okay. There was a lot of people with maracas or tambourines, and sometimes the music would break, the sound system would break down for a short while, and everyone would just continue the party with their percussion instruments. But it wasn't like a jam session where everyone is listening to. David was into the recorded music and playing the recorded music. Okay. He loved the stereo system and that. But there would be some live performances, definitely. But that was a full band, not really jam sessions,
And the fact that there's a shift between also the substances in the 70s, and the vibe changes completely. I don't know if we can opposite like the clubbing culture with cocaine in the late 70s to the LSD in the early 70s.
Well, it comes, Studio 54 is notorious for being cocaine, and there's a bunch of other cocaine, and to my mind, cocaine is I don't want to be judgmental, but I don't think it's a good party drug because it's about the self, boosts the ego, and really you want the ego to dissolve to everyone to be connected and to feel free. So generally speaking, the Loft remained an LSD party for the most part. I mean, certainly there was a diversification of substances that were taken, but it was never really a cocaine kind of party. Crack cocaine went through a lot of New York, especially the East Village, in the 1990s, but it never really came properly into the party. It was primarily, there were other different things would come into the party. It did become more diverse. Generally speaking, the Loft remained a psychedelic kind of party, but certainly there was other things were tried out. There's no doubt about that.
I was not talking about the Loft in general, but more on the perspective of this exhibition. Is like the vibe shift.
It went to cocaine, but around, I'm not sure of the exact date, but certainly by the mid-1980s, it was MDMA was coming in very strongly.
And it's not the fact of the vibe of creating a community and like the sound of trance, really.
Yeah.
Not dance trance, but not trance in the style of music, the trance of elevating the self.
Well, I think, as I said, there was cocaine came into a lot of the more, the clubs that were more about the self, which was Studio 54 was about, oh, I'm so fabulous kind of thing. So that cocaine worked well there. But generally speaking, let's call them the underground clubs or the invite-only clubs or the downtown club scene. It was never really a coke scene per se. I mean, there was a lot of psychedelics, other things, people like ups and downs, basically, I suppose. But MDMA came through strongly. And the next big drug was MDMA.
I was talking to Douglas.
Oh, right, okay.
Club here in New York.
Oh, Douglas Sherman.
Douglas Sherman,
Nice.
He came recently in Paris.
Oh, of course, I wanted to come for that.
And we were talking exactly about the spirituality on the dance floor.
Yeah.
That it's a pretty unique way to see the dance floor, to perceive the dance floor. Do you think the people were on the height of this concept, or they were just letting go? And I mean, do they understood?
I think people came with different ideas. There wasn't an official published ideology. David didn't really talk in these terms. David talked about love, or he talked about music, or he might talk about community, or he might talk about freedom. But he didn't. I mean, sometimes I feel that spiritual people don't talk about being spiritual. Yeah. So David exuded their spirituality maybe, but I wouldn't say he really talked about it. And in those terms as such. Look, you got a room full of people many on psychedelics, dancing to incredible music. A lot of it is about themes of love or freedom or dancing with incredible instrumentation. And there's going to be something collective emerges. That's something that is between all of these bodies in the room and the music. So it becomes sort of psychic on some level, and people can feel connected with each other and with humankind and with the universe. Now, you can call these things spiritual experiences. I think that's absolutely going on. I just don't think there was an explicit discourse of spirituality and like the tie-dye, maybe the hippie, it happened through practice. And it was experienced. You left with a heightened sense of sensation or of love. And some of these people are have very developed understandings of, say, psychedelics or spirituality.
I was making the link with, a current at the moment since 10 years, really vibrant, that's called ecstatic dance.
Right, okay.
And which is kind of linked with what's happening at the Loft. It means like you let all your metals or your things aside and you come just for the dance, not talking to each other, just for dancing.
David didn't like the rule. David didn't want too many rules. They're not talking to each other. That's not freedom, and there's nothing wrong with talking with each other a little. There's all sorts of forms of spiritual practice through dance, which I think is beautiful and wonderful. But I think a lot of those things, there's no real comparison with the music, and a lot of these places there won't be psychedelics as well. Also, you've got to remember, David's music selection was like so advanced. His ear was incredible. His way he put these records together. I don't know anyone who has David's capacity. I've heard many wonderful DJs, but none really, David, I mean, this is
you're talking about the sequencing?
I'm talking about the actual music itself and the sequencing of the music in relationship to the energy of the crowd at that moment, where you feel, the person that people might say came closest is this DJ Larry Levan. Generally speaking, I feel like the DJs of the 70s were very advanced, and we've not yet caught up.
Also, they didn't have much technical solution to beat match the record. Also,
they were starting to do that, but beat matching was completely irrelevant.
No, but also there was not the technical.
They had techniques. They had a mixer. They could beat match. I mean, there were a lot
in the early 70s.
They could, I mean, mixing sort of became big in the second half of the 70s, I suppose. Disco came through, 4/4 bass beat. It was a more consistent BPM. And DJs got into mixing. But for David, that was the technical mixing was the least important thing. And actually, if anything, it made the music boring, because according to BPM, you have 1 BPM all night. it's boring. And you only bring in a record because it's the BPM, or you adjust the music to make it work to mix. And Dave was like, you shouldn't adjust the music. It's all about the message. Like, how does one record link to the next record sonically and in terms of its message and its energy and its storytelling, you know, all these things. That's what's in, that's the journey, that's the storytelling.
The trip.
It's largely a lost art. Yeah. Now, obviously, we live in a culture. Look, I have to say, the way that David approaches is there's a big comeback. The Loft is still going, of course, in New York, but there's lots of parties now inspired by David, by the Loft, by what's going on in New York, by what David did in London with a bunch of us, which became a platform for a lot of things to happen in Europe, including Sweet Apricots. That was through Slim coming to hear David, maybe not there, but anyway, the party in London. So it's spreading, and once you have this approach and you have a nice sound system, it allows you to approach things. You know, once you hear the music in a different way, it allows for other things to emerge.
A lot of DJs become DJs like now, like Laurent Garnier, become to be a lot more eclectic than when he was playing at Manchester, or Giles Peterson.
Well, Giles Peterson was always eclectic. Yeah. I don't personally. I think Giles is an incredible contributor to the culture in many different ways. But when I've heard him, I don't think of him as a storyteller. He plays really good music, but I don't think of him as a storyteller. Look, when you hear David used and many other as a story, you know, it's interesting. But yeah, I think I think a lot of this is in the air because beat mixing has become quite boring, and electronic music it's become very familiar to us.
And beat mixing plus playing the same kind of music, like it was when I arrived in this scene. It was the early 90s. It was the same kind of music, beat mixed all night long.
Initially, it was very exciting. We all loved it initially. As such, house music starts to be released in 1984. Before that, electronics, you know, it's the electric guitar, that's electric. But what we think of as electronic music made by a synthesizer and a drum machine, the synthesizers were being used from the early 70s onwards. But purely synthesizer music, well, we have some Kraftwerk, but they were pioneers. In terms of like music becoming all electronic, you know, so electro starts to come through in 1982, let's say. Planet Rock, it becomes embedded with house music. I would say overall, and that's 1984, and it takes a while to really become embedded. A friend said, "I hear there's, you know, let's go to the Hacienda," and it was what we call the second summer of love. And I walked into the Hacienda, and it was this club in Manchester, and it was like nothing I'd ever seen before. And it was house music with a DJ, a big sound system, and everybody with their hands in the air, whistles, wearing beach clothes, and everyone was on MDMA. I didn't have a clue about MDMA at that point, and it was an unbelievable scene. So that was 88. We get the phrase comes through: house music all night long, all electronic music, DJs mixing all night. I mean, personally, I've come to lose interest in this quite some time ago, but that's okay. It doesn't matter.
So about the eclecticism of his set, also.
It was just the times. There wasn't so much genre categorization. There wasn't so much genre discipline. Genres were fusing into each other. The recent history in the United States was that you had rhythm and blues music mutated into soul music with a bit of, which was really rhythm and blues plus gospel equals soul. And then out of that, and then funk came along, and then out of that disco emerged. But disco only really came through, honestly, in 74. You can hear some records in 73 that have got a disco element. Let's say the 4 on the floor bass beat in a record called The Love I Lost, which came out of Philadelphia in 73. It's got a disco-y feel, but it's really Philadelphia soul. Disco, 74, even 75. So we're already halfway through the 70s before disco comes through, and it's, you know, on the one hand it's kind of, there's an excitement to it because it's a sound that is being recorded specifically for the dance floor, a new group of people who want to listen to music, buy music, dance to music. So it's quite democratic. That's exciting, but it also is a way of commercializing the music, and that's less exciting because it gets named, it gets categorized, it gets, you know, put in a box. within 4 years or 5 years, disco's become boring, and there's a backlash. And the DJs who were the pioneers, they agree, it become boring. I'm the author of 3 books. The titles are Love Saves the Day, A History of American Dance Music Culture, 1970 to 79. A book called Hold On to Your Dreams, Arthur Russell and the Downtown Music Scene, 1973 to 92. Life and Death on the New York Dance Floor, 1980 to 83. And I'm completing a book now that is focused just on David Mancuso and the Loft, and that's an oral history. So 3 books and one about us will be born reasonably soon. And you have been running a party called Lucky Cloud Sound System since 2003, after David Mancuso approached me to start parties in London. I'm the author of 3 books. The titles are Love Saves the Day, A History of American Dance Music Culture, 1970 to 79. A book called Hold On to Your Dreams, Arthur Russell and the Downtown Music Scene, 1973 to 92. Life and Death on the New York Dance Floor, 1980 to 83. And I'm completing a book now that is focused just on David Mancuso and the Loft, and that's an oral history. So 3 books and one about us will be born reasonably soon. And you have been running a party called Lucky Cloud Sound System since 2003, after David Mancuso approached me to start parties in London. David Mancuso, the founding host of the Loft, and that was started with a bunch of other people and is still running. And I also started an offshoot party called All Our Friends in 2018 that's still running, and they're modelled as kind of invite-only parties with beautiful sound systems, and they're like house parties really. And I'm the co-host of a podcast called Love Is the Message. And for my day job, I teach at the University of East London.
What do you teach?
I teach now music. I mean, my background is in cultural studies, but I mainly teach music students. But I teach about music culture, music history. Yeah, it's good. I mean, I live a very fortunate life.
Creative, subversive, lucid.
Vous écoutez Lucidélique.